At last. It's the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Unfiltered. I hope you guys are all doing well, and if you're like me and you always question what the headlines are telling us, then I'm very glad that you've made your way to my corner of the world. So as always today, I'm going to be talking again about the Idaho 4 case. And I just want to say that I could just probably go on and on and on about this case, but like I said before, we're going to have to just go through one thing at a time. I've realized more and more that many people, when I speak to them, don't even know about this case at all. So today, I really just want to talk about the touch DNA that was found on the button snap of that knife sheath. And we'll go into it a little bit further than that. So look, I'm really not a DNA expert. I'm not a scientist, but I do have some kind of knowledge about how DNA is used in a trial. So if you have been following this case, then you're going to know about how this knife sheath was supposedly found at the crime scene. And we know that it was really a minuscule amount of DNA that was basically made up of skin cells. So when investigators pulled this sample of DNA, they ran it through the CODIS system. And of course, they didn't come up with any kind of a match. So they then submitted it to a genetic testing company. Now, these companies are the same kind of companies that are used to determine your ancestry or, things like that. So, of course, now they haven't found any match in CODIS. And this is when things are handed over to the FBI and they take over this part of the investigation from the Idaho State Police. And they start to form a sample. They also start to search databases that are basically used by the public. Then they start to reconstruct a family tree. And of course, this is in the hope that they can find maybe a family member to narrow down some kind of a potential match. So they're going about doing all of this. And if you guys remember, law enforcement, well, they did an interview with one of Kohberger's neighbors. And the thing is that Brian Kohberger had actually, he'd been interested in genetic testing. So what he did is he submitted his DNA, and this was basically so that he could learn more about his own ancestry. So, of course, it would be natural that Kohberger's profile would be in this database. Now, if you're going to look at my last video that I did about the vehicle, you'll see that this whole thing is going to go along basically the same line of investigation. And of course, law enforcement, they needed a lot more solid evidence than what they actually had, which is why I'm saying that it would have been very easy for them to obtain all that evidence from Brian Kohberger himself while he was still really living in Pullman, Washington. But, that is not what they did. So they decided that they were going to follow Kohberger all the way across the country. Yes, all the way across the United States in the hopes of collecting more DNA. So we know that in December of 2022, Brian's father, Michael Kohberger, he traveled from Pennsylvania to Washington to meet Bryan. And then they took this drive all the way back to Pennsylvania for this winter holiday that they were having, or he was going home. So we know that there were 2 traffic stops in Indiana. And the thing is, I don't believe that these traffic stops were a coincidence. Not at all. I mean, I've never heard of a case where anybody gets pulled over twice in roughly 10 minutes for following the car in front of them too closely. never ever heard of something like that happening. So the feds, well, we know that they were overhead already, and they were basically following Kohberger and his father along the entire route. So once they got to Pennsylvania, I'm talking about Brian, his dad, and the investigators. Well, Pennsylvania law enforcement, now they've got their eyes on Brian Kohberger, and they say that they saw Brian sorting through his trash and placing it into the neighbors' garbage cans. So then they begin going through all of this garbage, and they pull out a piece of trash, and they determine that the DNA on this piece of trash belongs to the father of the DNA that was found on the knife sheath. So they're calling a tip now to the investigators, and they let them know that they've made this huge connection. And remember that this is what they need to secure an arrest warrant. I mean, the whole thing was basically made to look like this search was legitimate when in fact it really wasn't. Because we all know now that the story that Brian Kohberger was dumping his trash into the neighbors' trash cans is absolutely not true. It's mainstream media madness again. But anyway, on the 30th of December 2022, a SWAT team stormed into the Kohberger family home, and they pulled Brian out. But here's the really sketchy part. Prosecutors and Detective Brett Payne later said that investigative genetic genealogy, or IGG evidence, this is the very thing that had led them to Brian in the first place. Well, they conveniently left that out of the probable cause affidavit and the arrest warrant. So basically, the whole tool that cracked this case wide open in the first place was erased from official documents. It was said that the prosecutors didn't rely on it, and also they didn't intend to introduce it at the trial. And in fact, in court filings, it was completely removed, which, of course, now this makes the case look much cleaner and much simpler and much more airtight than what it really was. It's just very wild to me to think that the whole foundation of this investigation, the very thing that led them to Kohberger, wasn't even acknowledged in the official paperwork. So once Kohberger was arrested, authorities collected a DNA sample from him using a cheek swab. The sample was compared to the DNA found on the knife sheath that was recovered from the crime scene, and the results showed a statistical match, meaning that basically DNA from the sheath was likely to have come from Brian Kohberger. But just stick with me on that story for a bit. So the K-bar knife is basically a combat knife with a 7-inch clip point blade. It's got a stacked leather handle, and investigators found a tanned leather knife sheath with a Marine Corps insignia that was partially under Madison Mogen's body. That is what we were told. Although now at this point we know that the sheath, it doesn't really seem to appear in the initial crime scene photos, and it only shows up a little bit later on. So I'm going to get more into that in a separate video, but it does raise a lot of questions, like when did the sheath actually get there, and how did it get there? And there's really no way to say for sure that this knife or the knife sheath belonged to Brian Kohberger. If you're looking at a place like Idaho, K-bar knives are very commonly used because these are people that really love the outdoors. And so there's a whole culture of hunting, fishing, camping, that sort of thing. So there were stories I saw online where the roommates and their friends had posed with similar kinds of weapons. Now, they may not have been an actual K-bar knife, but apparently these were all taken at a Halloween party. So what I'm saying is that this type of weapon is not really something that would be very unusual in a place like Idaho. And the whole thing is that when you're talking about a knife sheath, you have to understand that it's very unlikely that this kind of thing would fall off, even if there was a struggle. K-bar knife sheaths are designed to hold this weapon with a retention strap or a snap. And if you're talking about friction and the weight of this object, it would basically be kept in place. It wouldn't be loose or dangling around like a piece of Christmas tinsel. So it's very unlikely that this knife sheath would come off, even if there was a struggle. And so what I'm saying is, it would be very, very unusual that the sheath would just fall off and end up on the bed cover. As I mentioned before, I just can't seem to get my head around the fact that one person would be capable of taking out 4 people like this and then just leaving, and also leaving the accessory to the weapon right at the crime scene. It doesn't add up. And remember, the knife sheath is the only real physical evidence that was tying Kohberger to the scene at 1122 King Road. Now, the feds, while they were doing a lot of work behind the scenes, inside all of these genetic testing portals and using internal profiles, but there's very little public documentation about the exact steps or the methods that they used. And it's very suspicious. I mean, I do get that there is some privacy that is necessary during an investigation, but if you are claiming to be doing all of this testing, then you would surely want to show off where you did your work and where it came from. So once Kohberger was in custody, all the profiles that were used in the genetic genealogy process, well, they were basically deleted. And that is very strange. So on the 13th of November, Detective Payne, he transported the knife sheath to a temporary evidence storage area, and nobody logged it. So it wasn't until the next morning, on the 14th of November, that Detective Payne officially went and logged this knife sheath into evidence. And that basically creates a gap in the chain of custody. Even though it might seem like a very minor detail, in court, chain of custody gaps can be very heavily scrutinized. And this would be to challenge how reliable the evidence really is. So on the morning of the 14th of November, like I said, Payne, well, he gave this actual evidence to the storage unit, he logged it in, and that is where it stayed until the 16th of November. So from there, the evidence was then transferred from the Moscow Police Department to the Idaho Police Crime Laboratory. And mind you, there was a lot of other evidence, but for some reason, investigators were just focusing on this one specific piece of evidence, the knife sheath. So it was then taken to the laboratory, and Idaho State Police generated a DNA profile on the 20th of November. And like I said, they didn't find any match. But then on the 21st of November 2022, it was transported to Othram Laboratories in Houston, Texas. And that's where things changed. So Othram developed what is known as a SNP profile, an investigative genealogy profile, and they submitted it to the approved IGG companies. And of course, they didn't get any hits that linked them to Brian Kohberger, but they did get hits that linked them to 4 brothers. But then on the 10th of December 2022, the feds took possession of this SNP profile that was developed by Othram Laboratories. And then by the 19th of December, they provide the Moscow police a lead that belongs to Brian Kohberger. And they say that it is his DNA. And this is very suspicious. I mean, why on earth would it take FBI 9 days to identify Brian Kohberger as a potential contributor to the DNA if Othram Laboratories had already created this SNP? And all the feds basically did was they entered that SNP into the IGG databases. I mean, if they were operating above board, then they would have gotten a hit on Kohberger's DNA right away, because we know that he was already in those databases. And remember that the DNA by now had more than doubled in size. And the feds, well, they're not going to say exactly how that happened. But we do know that by the time it got from Othram Laboratories to the feds, that it really doubled in size. And how would the feds have known that Kohberger's DNA profile was in those databases other than that interview that they had with his neighbor? And from what I understand, Brian and his neighbor were fairly familiar with each other. I mean, they had talked quite a bit about things like politics, parties, and so on. So they did seem to get along reasonably well. But that really, to me, appears to be the only source of information the feds could have ever used. So from there, they decided to focus their attention solely on Brian Kohberger. So you can see already that just 3 videos in, I've shared only a little bit of information into it. There is a lot more, but there are a lot of gaps and things that don't make sense in this case. And as we know, Kohberger is behind bars. I would have personally liked to see the whole case go to trial. There is quite a lot that we have to take in when we start to look at everything. It does raise a lot of questions about how airtight this case really was. So you let me know your thoughts in the comments. I have linked an email in the description. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. It's absolutely free. And until next time, go do something nice for yourself, and I'll be back with more information.